I'm looking at your bookshelves behind you, which are very interesting. There are those vinyl records at the top as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are from my parents mostly. So great. I think let's rock and roll. Let's try. I understand we have an hour at least.
Yes,
Is
I mean, I've
is
no
that right?
problem actually now. Sorry,
Yeah.
my apologies. Actually, we've lost about a quarter of an hour. But if you, but you, I, we can go on as you long as long. I don't have
Okay.
anything else this morning.
All right. All right. Let's see how it goes. So so let me start then. Yeah.
With pleasure, certainly.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next episode of the Tax Stories. And today my guest is Philip Baker. Did I pronounce it right, Philip?
Absolutely right. Baker like baking bread.
Right, right. Philip is King's Counsel and barrister for about 37 years and guest lecturer at the University of Oxford, LLM, PhD, MBA, is an author of book Double Taxation Conventions. I saw a quote about you actually, a guru on treaty and cross-border tax, and a member of the Permanent Scientific Committee at IFA. I uh, I always, when I listen to your presentations at IFA congresses, I enjoy them very much. So that's why mainly this is primary reason why I thought I must have you on the podcast, and I'm absolutely happy to have you here. So thank you for that.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
And did I forget anything important about your
No, there's
brief?
nothing important about me at all, actually. I should say I used to be a member of the EFA Permanent Scientific Committee. I did 8 years as a committee member, and I've come off the Permanent Scientific Committee, but I am. I'm chairing one of the presentations at the EFA Congress in Cape Town, which will be in October this year. So
Mm.
if any of your listeners are going to be in Cape Town, I look forward to seeing them there.
Great, great. I will be at Cape Town as well, so hope to meet you in person there. But
Yep,
yep,
yep, that'd be great. Actually, we'll meet there.
great. Uh, I also saw that you're officer of the Order of the British Empire. The order is rewarding contributions to arts and sciences work with charitable and welfare organizations and public service outside the civil service. So, uh, is there a story behind what is it for?
A little bit. Yeah, I'm a formerly officer of the British Empire. It's kind of strange because we don't have a British Empire any longer. My wife, who is Chinese, translates it into Chinese as second order running dog of the British imperialists. It's I think it's a good. It's yeah, one of these sort of kind of medals or orders, and actually it has nothing to do with tax, but it has to do with kind of human rights work. My background, you might ask me about it later, was but I started with a background in Chinese law. I originally taught Chinese law at London University, and in 1989, when there was the Tiananmen Square democracy demonstrations in Beijing, and the Chinese government at the time sent the tanks in. A group of us who had been, most of us, involved in Chinese studies in some way, we got together to help the refugees from China to lobby on Chinese human rights. And for about 8 years or so, I was involved with refugees, political refugees from China, helping them if they came to the UK. And the British government, I think really in recognition of the group's work, but you can't give an award to a group. And as I was the one who they knew best, they gave me the award there. So I have a little medal. Which I can pin on, which I don't wear very often there. But so it has nothing to do with taxation, but it has to do with the human rights work.
Right. And I also saw mentioned somewhere that you are into sinology and Arsenal. I understand linked to Arsenal, but is your wife linked to sinology?
The sinology, Chinese studies, it goes back to the original study on Chinese law. Arsenal is a different matter. Arsenal is really through my children. My two sons are great Arsenal supporters, and we have some seats at Arsenal. And so occasionally, when one of the sons isn't going himself, they let me go and watch a match. But it goes back to Chinese studies, and that all goes back to boredom with tax. I know it's very hard for anyone to imagine that you can be bored with tax, but way, way back in the late 1970s, I was studying for my LLM at London University, and the LLM was primarily in tax law. But there were also lectures offered in Chinese law, including customary Chinese law, history, Chinese legal history. And I went to those lectures and I found that was frankly much more interesting than tax. So I kind of stopped the idea of going into the tax world and brought forward the idea of doing some research on Chinese law. And as I say, I taught for 6 years at London University and researched on Chinese law. And at that time, I learned Chinese. Um, and my Chinese then was actually quite good. I could speak it quite well there. I met my wife after Tiananmen Square when we were working with Chinese refugees. And people think that, oh, you learnt Chinese because you have a Chinese wife and you speak Chinese at home. But in fact, it's the other way around. I learnt Chinese first, and then subsequently I met my wife. And she is originally from China. She has an interesting
Mm.
story. If you want to do another interview, but nothing to do with tax, you can interview my wife because she was born in mainland China. Her father was a former local government official who had to escape from the communists into Hong Kong. And so my wife grew up in Hong Kong, then came to the United Kingdom as a student nurse. And stayed in the United Kingdom there. So she spent more years in the UK than she spent in China.
Mm. Right. And how did you meet her?
Well, that's a nice story, actually. I met her in the Grand Committee Room of the House of Commons of the Houses of Parliament in London. And that, again, was after Tiananmen Square, after the massacre there. She had organized a meeting to lobby MPs, members of Parliament, over Chinese human rights, and she was chairing the meeting. I attended the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, we approached one another from either end of the grand committee room, and we found that we had interests in common to do with China, and that's the rest is history, as they say.
Mm. Great, great. You told me your grandfather is from Latvia, actually. About one third of our listeners are from Latvia, so they
Mm,
might be interested to hear a bit more about your
yeah.
roots here.
Okay, well, my entire grandparents, all four of my grandparents, are from Eastern Europe. my family originates from Poland, um, but my grandfather, so my mother's father, was born in what is now Liepaja in
Hmm.
Latvia,
Right.
but used to be called Libau in
Yeah.
Kurland, so to the west of Riga, and his father came from Poland. Came from where most of the family on my mother's side all came from Kalisz, to the west of Poland. But it happened that my grandfather was born in Libau, and he lived there until he was 12 years old, and then came to England at the time. Um, for a long time, I knew that he had been born in Libau, Liepaja, but I knew nothing of the story at all. But it appears that my great grandfather married a girl from Latvia, and they settled for at least 25 years, I think, in the area of Libau. And then they left in the 1890s and came to England there. So I am one quarter Latvian.
Wow. What a story. And have you considered obtaining Latvian citizenship? Because I think
I
you
don't
could.
think I'm into. I would love to have Latvian citizenship because after Brexit, I have only a British passport.
Yeah, you
Um,
would become EU citizen now.
I would become an EU citizen there. I mean, we have evidence of the birth of my grandfather. My great grandmother was obviously from a Latvian family. I think they left too early. I've looked into the question of getting Polish citizenship, and if you have a grandparent who left Poland after the First World War, when the Polish Republic was first set up, then you can apply. And I have a colleague in Chambers who has Polish citizenship because of that. But my grandparents, they all left. The ones from Poland left again in the 1890s. I would be interested in that. It's quite interesting in a couple of respects because. I don't think I've actually got it anywhere on my CV, but I first went to Latvia in about the year 2000 or 2001, before Latvia joined the European Union,
Mm,
because there was a process of sort of training Latvian officials in the acquis communautaire, in the European established legal system. And I got a little contract from the European Commission to go to Riga.
mm,
And I traveled backwards and forwards 3 or 4 times, worked with the Ministry of Finance and with the State Tax Administration. And this was in Riga in 2001, 2002, something like that, before Latvia actually formally joined the European Union. And at the time, I never really thought about asking anybody about my grandfather's birth in Latvia or anything. As I say, I simply knew at that time that he'd been born in Libau. I didn't know that Libau was now called Liepaja. If I had
mm.
done, I would have loved to have visited Liepaja at that time to see what it was like just before joining the European Union there. But I had a very, very enjoyable time visiting Riga in the early 2000s. I have been back to Riga, and I've been to Liepaja about 2 years ago. My brother and I did a sort of trip back to visit where our grandparents came from, and we flew into Riga, stayed for a couple of days, then drove to Liepaja, and visited there for a couple of days, and then drove down into Poland. So I've been back more
Mm.
recently.
Right. And you've now we know whom to blame about Latvian tax system partially. so, so, but
Well,
what's your yeah?
it's very interesting actually because one of the things that I remember came out of it was I was talking about European Union tax law, or I think it was European Communities tax law still at the time, and I was explaining how, for example, there are restrictions on what a government can do. You can't give state aid through the tax system, for example, and I've been quite involved with state aid cases recently. And the people at the Ministry of Finance were fascinated by that because, as you all know better than I do, the political system in Latvia is unusual in that it's actually the same. It's the parliament that sort of writes the tax law. And they said, well, we have a problem with members of the same members of the parliament giving little tax breaks to industry in their constituency, and we never quite know how much taxes we can collect because we don't really have control. And this will actually give us the possibility of saying to members of parliament, you can't do that. You can't give a special tax exemption for companies in Daugavpils or places like that. There, so it was a very interesting experience for me there. It actually taught me quite a bit of European law because I had to sort of make certain I was completely on top of the European Union tax system in order to work with the people at the Ministry of Finance. From time to time at conferences, I still see some of the people from the Ministry of Finance and the State Tax Administration who I worked with. It's what is it? Over 20 years ago now.
Right. And you comparing what was Latvia then and now, what would be your sort of impression?
That's quite interesting because I mean, I can't. I only can compare Riga, and frankly, when I was there, as I say, about 2000, 2001, I could see that Riga, particularly the old town, was very beautiful, but it had been neglected. The buildings had not been very well maintained. Some of them had been pulled down. Generally, I thought this is a beautiful town, but it needs some love and care and attention and
Mhm.
some funding there. And I wondered how it would be when I went back. And going back, what, 2 years ago, it was lovely to see how beautiful really Riga is and how well it has been repaired and maintained. And if you think about the square in Riga, just by the museums and by the port, where there's the House of the Blackheads, beautifully rebuilt. That was just being renovated
Mhm.
when I went there in 2000 and covered over with scaffolding. And you could see this was a wonderful building there. And a lot of the buildings in the old town, doors were off and they needed painting and stuff like that. And all of the Art Deco area, the lovely buildings from the 1920s have now been repaired. My brother, who is formerly an architect, absolutely loved it. I mean, we walked
Mhm.
around. I am a great tourist ambassador. For
Mhm.
Riga. I think it's one of the loveliest towns to visit in Europe. I should say, because your law firm stretches across the Baltics, I've also been to Tallinn and to Vilnius, and I
Mhm.
like them as well, actually. Tallinn, I've only visited once. I've had a couple of invitations subsequently to go there for conferences, and I would love to get back again there. but haven't managed to do that yet. Vilnius, I also have been to a couple of times for lectures. And again, I've seen Vilnius gradually come back to life with more attention and the old buildings being renovated. So I very much enjoy it when I visit there. I must get back to Liepaja again, actually.
Mm,
There, I mean, it's a sad story in that I have no relatives there. Nobody survived the war. My great grandmother's family were all shot, so nobody survived. But I would be fascinated to go back and see again.
right. Um, Actually, there's more connection I was thinking about. That first of all, my wife, first wife, and daughter was from Liepaja,
Mm,
but my middle surname, your middle surname is Wolf, right?
yes.
My surname has been changed from Wolf to Taukac because Wolf was my mother. Uh,
Ah.
so maybe we are relatives.
It's possible. Wolf was my great grandfather on my father's side. His given name was Wolf,
Hmm.
and so my parents gave me the middle name Wolf there. So it's a long-standing family name there. But it was on my father's side, the family came from Augustova in the Masurian Lakes in the northeast of Poland, and my great grandfather came to England, and he was called his name was Wolf there. But what's the link? Is Taukash the is that does that mean wolf in Latvian or?
Well, it depends how you look at it, but the my father was explaining me that it's a combination of sort of fat cat, and it comes from the eastern part near by Russian border.
Yeah, yes,
So,
yeah.
so, but eh, what makes you happy in life apart work? Is that sinology you dig into, or something else?
Oh, I think I would probably say family makes me happy there. I'm happy when Arsenal wins. When Arsenal has a really good game. Their last game, they played Newcastle. It was a 4-1 victory, and they were really good goals there. And it was a really good game at the Emirates Stadium in London. I didn't actually see it at the stadium. The tickets were being used by my children and by a friend, but that makes me quite happy. Family, I
Mm,
think, family life
yeah.
there. My wife and I, we've been married more than 30 years now. Our children are grown up. We have three children, and happily they live quite close to here. They come back quite regularly. My oldest son lives about 10 minutes drive away. He's married. He and his wife are just moving house. We have twin boys. So the younger twin, he's staying with us at the moment because he's preparing for one of his exams. It's actually a tax exam, so he's studying
All
tax.
right.
And my daughter lives also in London, and she and her fiance they come to visit us quite regularly. So family makes me happy. I also like my colleagues in work. I'm certain you do as well. I'm certain that your law firm is a very happy family. Barristers. I'm a barrister, as you said. I'm at
Mm.
what's called a King's Counsel. I have to get used to that because for 20 years I was a Queen's Counsel, and then, of course, unfortunately, the Queen died, and I became a King's Counsel. Just to explain that, we have to kind of like two grades of barristers. But when you start off as a barrister, you are just plain ordinary barrister. And then after about 12, 14 years or so, if you've been moderately successful, you can apply to have the title King's Counsel now added, and there's a little competition for it. Not an examination, but they ask for references and they interview you, and they check on whether you really are an established lawyer, and then you get the title King's Counsel there. And so I've been a King's Counsel for 23 years there. So in my tax chambers, we have three of us who are King's Counsel, and the rest are what we call junior barristers. It doesn't mean to say that they're young, but it's just somebody who hasn't become King's Counsel. And it's a very happy law firm. You may find it interesting coming from a firm like Ryan, that the way we operate as a chambers is kind of like a cost sharing organization, but not an income sharing. We are each independent barristers. We have to be independent by the rules of our profession. So we are independent from one another, but for administrative convenience, we hire our offices, we hire a staff, we build up a library, and we share the cost of all of that. But then each of us has our own practice. And within that practice, we can specialize and we can have different clients. We can even act sometimes in the same matter on different sides. And there are times in the past when I have been on the different side of a case to somebody
Mm,
in my own set of chambers, which may seem very strange, the idea of acting on both sides. Obviously, we keep a sort of wall between us when that happens. So I wouldn't see documents that are going to the person on the other side. They wouldn't see my documents, but because we're each independent, we all have our own practices, but we share the costs of offices and staff there.
mm. And this King's Counsel position or title, does it give some privileges to work on the most complex cases or some others?
I don't know that I'd call them privileges as such. There are some very, very sort of minor privileges in that if, for example, there are applications to be made to the court. Because King's counsels are senior and more busy, we jump to the front of the queue. So if the court is hearing lots and lots of applications and a King's counsel comes along, the court will say, Mr. Baker, you're a King's Counsel. You can't. We'll hear you first. But frankly, that doesn't really happen these days. No, the main thing is that it's kind of like a mark of seniority, and some clients want to have the reassurance of kind of like of a sort of an established barrister. So until I became a Queen's Counsel, um, I, I, I didn't. I did a little bit of sort of work for multinational companies and big accountancy firms, the big law firms, but not the most of my work was not with them. It was much smaller firms. Once I became a Queen's Counsel, the big firms became more confident in using me. So I do a lot of work for the big four accountancy firms, the big London law firms. Generally, you get involved in the more complicated, more valuable cases. Once you're a King's Counsel. So it's not a privilege as such. It's simply the consequences of the fact that you've got a sort of mark that shows that you're senior in the profession. I think it's probably true. Once you become a partner in Sarinen in a big law firm, you'll do the more difficult work with the more major clients, as opposed to somebody who is, say, an associate there. It's the same sort of thing.
Right, right. Um, I wanted to ask also, have you found the mysterious work-life balance that overachievers not always see?
Well,
If yes, what's your approach?
I don't know that I'm an overachiever, but I think I have. But frankly, very much aided by the events of COVID, because of working from home. I think earlier on in my practice, I didn't have a good work-life balance. The difficulty with being a barrister is you can't really control the flow of your work. It depends on whether clients want to instruct you. You start off, nobody really knows your name at all. You're just trying to get whatever work you can. It comes in very gradually. You build up a reputation, and you get busier and busier, and you get very nervous about saying no to anybody, because you think, well, if you say no, I can't do it, they might never come back again on other matters. So I certainly for several years spent too much time in my chambers in work, and didn't see as much of the family as I would like. There were times when growing up, when my children were growing up, when I didn't see them as much as I would have liked. There were even family holidays that had to be cancelled at the last minute because we had everything ready, and then I would get some work in, and I would say, I'm sorry, I can't go actually there. Even before COVID hit in 2020, I was starting to spend, say, 1 day a week working from home. But of course, COVID meant that for over a year, I was based at home, hardly went out at the house, carried on working, but carried on working using Teams and Zoom, and doing everything online. And the really COVID accelerated the process of being able to communicate with people using the internet, and work from home. So nowadays, I go into my chambers about once a week. And the rest
Mm,
of the time, I work from home. I spent more time with my wife in the last 4 years than I've spent in probably the 20 years before that. So I think eventually I have come to a good work-life balance, but I don't think I had that in the earlier years there. What I see now from some of my colleagues, and again, it's because of the technology that allows them to work from home. Many of them spend many more days working from home, and they will only come into the office on days when they're seeing clients or they've got a court case, and then they'll actually come into the office. One of the consequences of that is that our offices, our chambers are very, very quiet. Used to be that Monday to Friday, 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night, virtually everybody would be in chambers. I spent much of my time talking to my colleagues, going and asking them for advice. Now, if I go into chambers, there may be only one or two of us there in the office, and that's we have obviously a training program for young barristers, and it's quite difficult to run that because the young barristers, the trainees, the pupils, sometimes they're in the office almost alone by themselves and nobody there to train them or talk with them. So COVID has changed the way we work. We could never have done an interview like this before COVID. The technology helps, but I think people are settling down to how they want to balance their time in the office, their time at home, their work and their work and their home activities.
certainly. Um, Looking back at your career, what are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of there? I think a lot of the things, I think if I'm looking to be for proud, I would say things that I did actually related to work, but that were not directly client matters there. I've won some cases, I've lost some cases. I suppose I'm happy that I won the cases. I don't know. I would say I was pretty proud of those, but there were things outside of work. For example, you mentioned at the beginning IFA, the International Fiscal Association. Well, I've been the general reporter on IFA topics twice, and in particular, the second time, just over 10 years ago, I was the general reporter together with Pasquale Pistone from the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation, and we worked on the practical protection of taxpayers' rights. And that's an area that I am proud that I'm one of the people who developed the whole idea of protecting the rights of taxpayers and using the law and the practice of tax administrations to give a better treatment for taxpayers. And that's certainly something that I am pleased that I worked on. 10 years ago, we as general reporters of IFA, as you know, you have the great privilege of being able to get branch reports from national reporters from around the world. And we had about 44 branch reporters reporting on the protection of taxpayers' rights in their countries. And then we assembled that information and we used it to develop quite a new concept at that time, the idea of minimum standards and best practices for the treatment of taxpayers in order to protect taxpayers' rights. So, for example, to protect confidentiality, we considered it was a minimum standard that only those tax officials who had a direct interest in the tax case of a particular taxpayer, only then could actually access the information. That's the minimum standard. We expect every tax administration to at least observe that. But the best practice is to have all of the information about a taxpayer encrypted so that nobody can access it unless they have the encryption code, and that any unauthorized access, anybody tries to get into it, automatically triggers warnings, and the tax administration must stop any unauthorized access through the encryption. And I think a lot of tax administrations follow that. And we've just actually been going through a process earlier this year of updating the minimum standards and best practices because in some ways we can see from the reports that have followed the practice in some governments has got better. And so
Mm.
what was previously a best practice is now a minimum standard, and there are new best practices. And we're developing new best practices with regard to the use of artificial intelligence. I imagine in the Baltics, you're probably very advanced on that. Estonia, particularly, is electronically one of the most advanced tax administrations in the world. And the use of artificial intelligence can be very helpful for taxpayers and can be very helpful for the administration, but it also risks dangers as well if the algorithm starts to go wrong and starts to teach itself the wrong things. So we've been developing new principles. I'm very proud of that. I'm quite pleased about some of the big cases I've been involved in there, but I don't know that I'd say I'm proud. I'm just happy.
Right. Actually, both topics are very important for our country as well. I think the AI, there are many uncertainties if the tax authorities will be able to explain the roots of their decisions if they let the machines in much more than
Mm.
now. And regarding the taxpayers' protection, we have had some really loud corruption cases in tax authorities. So this encryption would be a nice protection against such cases as well, right?
Yeah, very much so, because if you think about it, we give to the tax administration information about ourselves, which would be we would not want that to be accessible to the public at all. I mean, apart from personal information like dates of birth, tax identification numbers, telephone numbers, family members, we also give information very often about things like which charities we make donations to. And from that, you could work out whether you're a supporter of a particular political party, what your religious affiliation might be, what your personal sexual orientation might be there. And it's hugely important that that information is protected and should only be accessed by the tax official actually dealing with your tax affairs. And clearly, there's a huge danger that you get a bad tax official who starts to steal the data, say the information about politically sensitive persons or business people, and sells that information. So it's hugely important that the tax system has protections against that. And with AI, it's an early stage, but we've had scandals like the Dutch child benefit scandal, where
Mm.
the tax administration gave a child benefit to families with children, but there were fraud cases. And the AI algorithm identified that a lot of the fraud cases, the people involved were living in a particular part of the Netherlands, and they came from Romanian background. They had Romanian names there. So the AI taught itself to challenge every claim by somebody from Romanian background there. And it became discriminatory in a way that you absolutely would not want that to happen. And in fact, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands resigned over this scandal. Um, in the UK, it's not the tax administration, but we've had a big scandal over the post office and sub postmasters, people who run a local post office as a business, being prosecuted because they were supposed to have been stealing money. But it turns out they weren't stealing the money, it was the computer system that was I, actually misrecording and looked as though they were stealing the money. But of course, nobody could challenge the computer system. The computer said, there should be this amount of money, and there wasn't that amount of money. So they said, well, you must have stolen it. And there, interestingly, the company that supplied the software for the post office in the UK also supplied software for the tax administration. And so people are beginning to say, well, maybe we've had problems with the tax administration. Maybe people haven't yet realized that the computer software was giving us the wrong information about tax there. Um, Little personal example. I paid my taxes at the end of January. We pay our taxes in two amounts at the end of January, the end of July. I paid tax at the end of January. Just the other day, I got a letter from the tax administration saying, you owe us, and not a huge amount, but you owe us some money. And I immediately contacted my accountant and I said, how did this happen? Because I paid everything. And he says, yes, you've paid everything. Maybe it's a computer error. So, and I was talking to one of my colleagues in my office yesterday. She's had a similar letter, and I'd be interested to know whether something's gone badly wrong with the computer systems. So,
Right.
yes, protection of taxpayers' rights and the dangers of AI are very, very apparent.
And I suggest everybody who wants to know more about post office scandal can read. I think Dan Neidle was publishing a lot about this.
Dan
Uh,
Neidle has very
Needle.
much focused on that, actually. There's also a wonderful TV Channel 4 little mini series called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which I'm certain you can get that on YouTube now there. And it's a really interesting dramatization of what happened with the Post Office. Everybody, frankly, around the world should look at it because it shows what happens when the post office is government controlled, and when a body gets out of control and starts relying upon computers and says, well, the computer must be right. The computer tells us that there should be £10,000. It isn't there. You must have taken it, and you've got to put it back. Or we will take you to court. And the post office, and even now, the scandal, the post office is not completely resolved in this country. Oh, I'm delighted to see that Dan Neidle has followers in Latvia, in the Baltic states. Dan's doing some very good work.
He does. He does. Actually, I'm reading now a book on this Icelandic banking scandal, and also there was a part of the book was on a bug in software where because of this software the investors lost some money, and basically the management of the bank just were like brushing it under the rug. So a lot of those things are happening nowadays.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
but you have achieved so much. You must have some principles to share. How did you do that? Any gurus or books that inspire you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think if I were asking about gurus, I'd have to be slightly personal and say my father. My father was a chartered accountant, and he did quite a bit of tax work. And I grew up with copies of the tax legislation, copies of the British Tax Review lying around the house. So when I went to study at university, it was not surprising that I took a tax course, found it interesting, and carried on. And he was an accountant from the age of he left school at 16, went into training, and right the way until his death, he was involved in accountancy. He was very, very upright and very, very open and straightforward. He was never involved in anything to do with any tax avoidance. And I learned from him very early on that you have got to always approach matters on the basis that you will tell the full truth to the tax administration. If there is something that has to be disclosed, you must disclose that, and you have to be fully open and transparent with the tax administration. And I approach any advice on the basis that the tax administration is entitled to know all of the facts. If anybody says to me, I say to them, well, if you do this, it will give rise to a tax charge. And the person says, well, how will the tax administration know? I get very angry, actually. Angry is perhaps overstating it, but I would say, look, you cannot proceed on that basis. You can only go ahead on the basis that the tax administration are being told everything. And if you telling them everything, you don't have a tax charge, then you are not avoiding tax. You simply don't have a tax liability there. And if somebody says, ah, yes, well, this works because the tax administration won't understand it, and I say, don't touch that at all there. So that's, I think, an important principle. I think also service and duties to clients are hugely important, and that's something that we're trained of as barristers. When you're a lawyer, you're trained that you are obliged to give your very best efforts on behalf of your client. And that may involve doing things that are against your own interest, but are in the interests of the client. Sometimes, I've appeared in a case and I think, well, being on this side of the case won't necessarily help my own practice to develop. Doesn't matter. You have your obligations to your clients. I've been very lucky to interact with some very, very good tax lawyers, both in the UK and in other countries. And I've also been able, particularly with regard to court work, to observe some very good litigators in practice there. That's helped me, I think, to develop your practice. I think, as a general matter, it's very important always to be looking at how other lawyers are acting and saying, would I do that? Um, can I pick up some skills from the way in which this person is handling the case? And I think I've learnt through the years from that. But in terms of
Right.
gurus, my father.
Yeah. And in terms of books, any suggestions for my bookshelf?
Well, I see you've got a lot of John Grisham books behind you
That's
there.
right.
Good for looking about learning how law firms should not be operating there. Um, uh, I try to read quite a lot of textbooks. I don't know whether you can see on my shelf, but over there, there's a section where at the beginning of COVID, actually there wasn't a bookshelf there. There was a gap,
Ah,
and I had a
okay.
little pile of books that was waiting to be read. And gradually the pile got higher and higher there. Um, and now that's actually a double level of books. There's another layer behind there. I think if I were, I mean, it's hard to recommend any particular book. One of the books that I've read recently, and it's from a very, very old friend of mine called Richard Collier. Who you might like to interview sometime. He'd have a great story. But Richard wrote a book called Banking on Failure, which sounds like a
Hmm.
strange title. I think I've probably got the book here. I might find it there. Banking on Failure. And what it is, it's a very detailed analysis of the cum ex scandal, which took place in Germany. He wrote about the German cum ex scandal with tax issues at the background to it there. Richard, he's retired now, but for many years he was at PwC, the accountancy firm, and he was the head of the financial services transfer pricing work. And in fact, he went to work subsequently, and he retired for the OECD for a time. So he's got a very interesting story there. But he became fascinated with the cum ex scandal. How could lawyers have convinced themselves that you could make multiple claims for repayment of tax based upon just one dividend? A German company would pay one dividend on its shares, and documentation would be generated, would lead to two or three or four different people making claims for the repayment of the tax. And he not only explains how this worked and how it came about, but also asks the question about the ethical approaches of the lawyers. How could lawyers have convinced themselves? As you know, the head of the German branch of a major law firm has recently been sent to prison because of his
Hmm.
involvement with this. And Richard sort of asks the question: how did people get involved in all of this there and convince themselves that it was lawful? So I'd recommend that book there.
So did he give an answer? I was following the story on the Financial Times actually. It's very fascinating. But did he give a hint? Was it deliberate action or he was like somehow tricked by the clients.
And they weren't tricked by the clients. I think they knew what they were doing, but they, they just never sort of asked, is this ethical? Is this lawful? It was, I think, more a sense that. I don't think he really does give an answer. He raises the ethical questions. How
Mm,
could people have answered this? And I don't think he's interviewed them as to why they actually thought that it's okay. I think part of it comes from a sense of um, ah the tax system is broken here. It's allowing us to make multiple claims. Why shouldn't we exploit the element of being broken for the benefit of our clients? Our clients think that we're wonderful if we can tell them, yes, you can get money back, you can pay less tax there. And you forget about the fact that there's a responsibility to society. Society needs tax funding in order to pay for schools, hospitals, military expenditure, particularly significant these days. And people forget that, and they just focus on, my client thinks I'm brilliant because I can tell my client how to get three or four different repayments of tax. So I don't know that they ask themselves the ethical questions there.
mm. There's an interesting report also by OECD on enablers of tax crime,
Mm,
and I was when reading the report, I was thinking about all the tax fraud cases, especially VAT fraud, uh, that this is the system's fault that such fraud for so huge amounts is ever possible. Do you see some medicine in the system against it? Uh, is that the system's fault, or because yesterday I was reading about a huge scandal of 2.6 billion laundered money by Italian mafia guys in Lithuanian fintech. These things happen almost on daily basis. So th- is it only bad behavior, or do we need to change something in the system?
It's both, isn't it? Because the system has not been well designed to prevent fraud. People, when they're designing the system, when they're putting the law together, don't ask themselves, how is this going to work in practice, and is it capable of being used in a fraudulent way? I have to say, I think in this country, the UK revenue authorities are actually quite good at thinking about the possible fraudulent use of the tax system when they develop. We have a big tradition of putting in anti-avoidance measures whenever we put in tax provisions. But even then, you have reports of large-scale unauthorized applications whenever a tax system provides for a relief and particularly a repayment, money coming from the government, almost always there are going to be people who think, how can I get that money out of the government without actually qualifying for it as such? So we have had research and development allowances, which give rise to some actual repayments. And at the moment, we're starting to have cases brought forward of clearly fraudulent claims that somebody should not raise. But it's also personal behavior, um, partly on the part of the tax professionals, because nearly every single case there will have been a tax professional who was asked to give their advice. If we did this, would we get the relief that we're trying to rely upon there? So nearly always there will have been a professional involved. The professional may not have been shown all of the details. They may have been asked a very specific question, in these sets of facts, will this happen? I think professionals have to have their eyes open and to say, well, why are you asking me this question? That set of facts sounds a very unusual set of facts. What's your background to it? And to call out situations where we think the things are fraudulent. I mean, in my practice, fortunately, not very often, but occasionally, people have come to me with a particular proposal, and I have said, no, don't do that. That would be fraudulent, might even be criminal. There, many years ago, had some clients who came to me, and they had a proposal put to them by a tax advisor for a way of getting the money out of their pension pot without paying any tax whatsoever. And as soon as you look at that, you think this can't be right. You know, the tax system should not work that way. When you get your pension, you know, you've got a deduction when the money goes into the pension. You should pay tax when it comes out there. And they came along with the accountant who had devised this scheme. I looked at it and I said, quite frankly, I think you're committing a fraud on the revenue. And I told the clients, don't touch it whatsoever.
Mm.
The advisor who came with them got very upset. And he said, yeah, but I've got an opinion from X and Y, and they all say it works. And I said, well, look, I don't care what X or Y said. My opinion is it doesn't work and it's fraud on the revenue. Subsequently, I knew X and Y. They were other barristers. I contacted X and Y. Both X and Y had said this doesn't work. But the accountant was saying, I have opinions from X and Y. Yeah, they had opinions, but the opinions were that it didn't work. So even he
Mm.
was just the advisor who'd come up with this. I mean, he was subsequently struck off as an advisor. I don't think he went to prison, but he's certainly no longer involved at all. So one of the elements is also ethical behavior on the part of the advisors. Slightly, if I may push it in a direction, the discussion, one of the courses that I teach at Oxford is a course on ethical issues in tax practice. And I think it's the first similar course about ethical issues that is taught anywhere in Europe. In the US, if you go to law schools, it is not unusual to find courses in ethical issues, including ethical issues in tax practice. Not that it makes American lawyers more ethical, probably less, but they do have courses on that. But we introduced this as a first course ever in Europe, and I hope that more universities will pick this up and they will start saying that we should be teaching ethical issues for tax lawyers, so that lawyers don't feel that I will do everything for my clients to get them the money out of the tax system. But they will say to the clients, no, this is not consistent with the object and the purpose of the legislation. To go ahead with this would be aggressive tax planning. It may even be tax evasion. It may even be fraudulent.
So it's still a lot up to us tax lawyers to be prudent in that. Uh, but how do you see the taxation developments in general now? We discussed a lot of changes now in our environment, that we have wars in Europe. We had pandemic has changed the way we work, technology, environmental issues, mobility, globalization, all affect companies. How do their business? How do you see the taxation should catch up?
Very clearly, as you quite rightly say, governments around Europe need to make certain that their tax resources are very solidly there. And we've seen post-COVID the effective tax collection in many European countries increase. I mean, in my country, we have one of the highest tax burdens that we have ever had since the Second World War in terms of the amount of tax to GDP. The tax ratio is higher than it's been since the end of the Second World War. In principle, the government is trying to bring that down. We have an election this year. They think that maybe reducing the tax burden might help the Conservative government to remain in power. I don't think it will, but we have high tax levels, and I think realistically we're going to have to live with those in many countries for several years to come. Because we are paying back the costs of the pandemic, and because, sad to say, we need to have a robust defense system, as well as also good education, good health. And that, I think, means that governments are going to be looking for tax opportunities that they didn't have previously, where there were certain potentially taxable sources that have not been taxed fully. So, to give you two examples, historically in this country, we did not tax non-residents on gains, even buying and selling UK land. So if foreign investors bought land in the UK and made a profit, we didn't tax it. We changed that a couple of years ago. That was clearly a gap in the tax system. We also have special rules for so-called non-doms, non-domiciled individuals.
Mm.
Those rules are almost certainly going to disappear this year or next year. There. The large multinationals providing digital services, they have enjoyed a very protected tax position, not paying taxes on digital supplies into countries for the last 10 years or so. I think digital service taxes, taxes imposed on the supply of electronic automated digital services, they are coming in. We have one in the UK. I don't know the position in the Baltic countries. The US has been very opposed to that on behalf of the large digital companies, many of which are US digital companies. But the agreement in October 2019 was that countries would not collect their digital services taxes or not impose them as long as there was going to be an agreement at the OECD on Pillar One.
Um,
That has not happened. The moratorium on digital service taxes ended at the end of last year. And so countries like Canada said, well, in that case, we're going to have a digital service tax. They've pushed it back to June in the hope that they can get an agreement on Pillar One. It's not going to happen.
mm.
And so I think we're going to see multiple digital service taxes being implemented around the world. Interesting question as to how the Americans react to that. They put pressure on countries like France not to collect their digital service tax. But if the Americans are blocking a Pillar One agreement, they really cannot now stop countries from introducing digital service taxes, and that for some countries will be a very effective way of collecting some tax from international automated services. A danger with that, unquestionably, is a danger of double taxation. There, we are using a particular software, you and I, to communicate. Could well be that in future, both the Latvian government and the British government will impose a digital service tax on the supply of the software to allow us to communicate. And one of the consequences going forward is I think we are already seeing a big increase in unrelieved international double taxation, and not enough attention is being paid to making certain that people don't pay tax twice in two different
Right,
countries. That's a very important issue that has been neglected over the last 10 years or so.
right. And we are living on the border with the aggressor country, and I mentioned the war now in Europe. Do you see the taxation system somehow should intervene in stopping the transactions with Russia? So because we see that still a lot of companies are um, continuing to trade with Russian companies.
It's hard to see how that's a matter for the tax system unless you draw the boundaries of the tax system very widely. I mean, obviously, we all have anti-money laundering obligations, and we all have know your client obligations, and we can't deal with or provide advice to those who are subject to sanctions. So if I take on a Russian client, I have to do the usual checks to make certain that they are not under any sanctions whatsoever. But in terms of the tax system, if the person is not sanctioned, it's very hard to see on what basis we can simply refuse to act for them there. Well, what we do need to make certain is that they pay their taxes properly and promptly, and so they are actually funding the defensive activities of the NATO countries against the aggressor. I mean, since we all live on the border of the aggressor virtually every day, Russian bombers come down the North Sea and test the UK's air defences. They have to be scared off by fighter jets there, and we've had threats to the UK there. There is, it's not a tax issue, but European solidarity and NATO solidarity is critical. One of the greatest disappointments of my life, I think it's probably that right, was Brexit. The UK leaving the European Union there. I think that was a huge mistake. I think it was engineered partly by Russia, that there are unanswered questions about how the funding, how the anti-European movement, the Brexit movement, how it was funded, and whether money came directly or indirectly from Russian sources. I think it really helped Russia's position to break the United Kingdom away. And it worries me also that the position with NATO, this is well away from the tax system, but the position with NATO is not as solid as it would have been. I fear hugely the possibility of a Donald Trump presidency. I think every European should be contacting all of their friends in America and saying, look, if you can't vote for Joe Biden, at least don't vote at all there. But for God's sake, don't put Donald Trump into the White House, because if you're doing that, you are seriously undermining the protection that NATO has given us since the end of the Second World War. And when you have a president who, a presidential candidate who says, well, if countries in Europe don't contribute to NATO, then I invite the Russians to threaten that country, or to do even worse. You cannot have somebody like that in the presidential position in a key part of the NATO protection. Now, that's well away from the tax system, but I
Yeah,
guess the tax system has a relevance there, actually, which is I do hope that the IRS is looking very, very seriously at Donald Trump's tax affairs there. The IRS has in the past used their powers to, Al Capone, the gangster, was sent to prison not by the FBI but by the IRS. So I'm hoping that they are looking very, very carefully at the tax affairs of potential presidential candidates.
right. Uh, but yeah, I let's leave politics for a while, but I wanted to ask you also, as a human rights expert, what do you think of progressive taxation? Is that fair tax?
It's very fair, and it's probably not progressive enough, quite frankly.
Mm,
I mean, interesting to get onto human rights. There's a sort of two aspects of human rights and taxation. One aspect of it is the sort of the individual rights, the taxpayer, the confidentiality of the taxpayer's information, the access that the taxpayer has to a fair tax tribunal, those sort of individual rights. The other side of it is the collective rights, the interests that the whole of society has in the tax system delivering the goods that the society needs. So, using the tax system to ensure that there is adequate provision for health, for education, not just in your own country, but in other countries as well.
mm,
If the tax system is encouraging tax avoidance in the developing world, as a result of which the governments in the developing world are unable to advance the education and health of their population, then the tax system internationally is working very badly. And I think one element of the tax system helping society is also to reduce massive inequalities of wealth. We have seen that the last 10 years, um, probably because we've been focusing on the wrong issues. The disparities of wealth within countries and between countries have grown. Um, COVID, for example, had a huge impact in this country on the differences between the wealthiest part and the poorest part of the population. Many of the poor part of the population suffered very badly during COVID. They lost jobs, they lost earnings, whereas some of the wealthiest people made huge profits out of COVID and the wealth disparities. We have to reduce those disparities of wealth, and the tax system must play a part. So, whether wealth taxes are a good idea or not, I'm not convinced. But we do have to look at gaps in the tax system. I mentioned earlier the UK rules for non-domiciled individuals. Those rules, which were entirely logical when they first came in, have been used to protect the growing wealth of a very small part of the population who have seen their wealth grow without paying tax, whilst the rest of the population have been bearing the rest of the burden of supporting the welfare state. So I'm not at all surprised that those rules are pretty certain to disappear in the UK there. We have, at the same time, we've got to accept that if you're moving from a low tax country to a very high tax country like the UK, the tax system could deter people from moving, and we may need to have some sort of transitional provision for people who come only for a short period of time. But gaps in the tax system need to be filled. And I think, again, we go back to tax advisors. We know where the gaps exist there, and we have to be prepared to say to clients, look, um, there is a special regime that that will give you a low tax result, but you have to understand that regimes like that do not provide good basis for a tax system, and it is very probable that this will be closed, this gap, in the near future. So don't assume that this is going to give you the sort of protection for long term.
right. And from that fairness perspective, do you agree that small businesses should pay smaller tax burden that comparing to the larger businesses?
It's an interesting question as to whether progressive taxation only relates to individuals or also relates to businesses as well. it raises the question of who are we really taxing when we tax a company? Um, Companies do not ultimately bear the cost of tax. Somebody bears the cost of the tax. The ultimate burden falls on the employees, the investors, the executives of the company. Um, I think it's right to have a degree of progressivity. Small businesses, you would expect to encourage them to grow, that they would enjoy, while they're in their growth stage, a relatively easy tax system. And that includes not just the burden, but also the compliance costs there. It's very unfair to impose massive burdens on small businesses, burdens of compliance, whether it's VAT compliance, whether it's profits tax compliance. Large businesses can bear a bigger burden there. But I must make one point here, actually, and that is when new tax provisions are introduced, the compliance costs have to be taken into account. For example, Pillar two, the minimum global minimum tax, the globe there, that's been introduced as as a fairness measure, but the system that's been introduced via the OECD and which the EU has largely adopted through the directive on the global minimum tax, is incredibly complicated. The compliance burden is huge. The only people who are going to really benefit from this are the big accountancy firms who are going to implement it there. The actual amount of tax that will be collected is relatively small. The compliance costs are huge. And that is a very, very bad tax proposal if it collects small amounts of tax but imposes a huge compliance burden. I think the OECD has made many mistakes in international tax over the last 20 years, but the biggest mistakes are probably bringing forward Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And unfortunately, the European Union has decided to internalize this through a directive, which means that this compliance burden will be shared by European companies. The UK also has a global minimum tax, so we also have this issue. The difficulty is that it's very hard to reverse these things, even if it's becoming increasingly apparent to everybody that this was a total mistake. Somebody actually being able to stand up and say, this is a mistake, we must stop it. Yeah, no politician is likely to come up and say that. And however much businesses say, look, it's costing us a huge amount just to prove that we don't have a tax liability at all. People will simply say, "Oh, well, that's businesses making pleas for themselves. They don't want to pay their taxes." We're not really tackling some of the major problems of international taxation, and certainly that Pillar Two is not really a solution to the major problems.
Right. And our podcast is called Tax Stories. My final question is I saw also you were working with or are working with private clients. Uh, if we look at your court cases like disputes, are there any juicy stories you would like to share? Any one of those disputes you would like to pick?
Um, any one of those particular disputes. I mean, I have obligations of confidentiality to particular clients. I mean, on the private client side, I was quite pleased at the end of last year to win a very, very long-running case, which we got the judgment from the UK Supreme Court in October last year. The case actually began in the year 2000, so it took 23 years to get to a final judgment, which is actually disgusting. No tax litigation should ever have taken that long to go ahead. And that involved a small family. They had absolutely no choice but to protect their business. They had to move the business to Gibraltar. All of the other companies in their particular business, which was online betting, they had all moved to Gibraltar. And if they did not move their business, then they simply couldn't compete and they would just go bankrupt. They moved. And the UK revenue used an anti-avoidance measure, which had nothing to do with betting or anything like that, used it against them. And they said, we're not liable. And it took 23 years to prove that they were not liable
Well,
to tax there. So that's a sort of success story on the part of a taxpayer there. I think actually some of the cases that I've dealt with in the European Court of Human Rights have been rather successful. If you want to know the story, I've got a little case where somebody came to see me and they said, I think I've been very unfairly treated. I lived with my partner for many years and we had a child together, and then we decided to split up. And as I am a responsible father, I agreed to make payments for the maintenance of my daughter, paying my former partner. Now, I understand that there is a tax relief that I am entitled to deduct those payments made for the support of my daughter. Um, and we said, yes, there is that tax relief, but it is only available if you have been married to the your partner. If she had been your wife and you had separated, whether you were divorced or not, you would get this tax relief. But because you were never actually married, you can't get the tax relief. And the client said, I don't understand why it makes a difference whether we were married or not married. We've separated. Who cares whether we were once married or we just lived together? What difference does it make? And I said, I agree with you. It really shouldn't make a difference. This is discriminating between you according to whether you were married or not married, even though in both situations, the marriage has ended or the relationship has ended. And that case went to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court said, yes, this is discriminatory. Why, you know, when people are still married and living together, yes, the tax system can treat married couples differently from unmarried couples. But once the relationship has ended, who cares whether you were originally married or just living together? The position is still the same. The man has responsibility for looking after the daughter. He wants to fulfill that responsibility. He should get the tax relief. So he got the tax relief. It wasn't a lot of money, but I got a very nice letter from him a couple of months later saying we got, it was a few £100 back from the tax administration. So I've used the money to take my daughter on a holiday there because I now feel that I've been fairly treated and I can give my daughter a treat. So little cases like that, which I did that case completely pro bono. That took no fees at all for that. That was a successful story there. A little story, but a nice one.
very nice one. So thank you, Philip, for that and for all the time together with you. So just one last question to every of my guests is on a philosophical note. What is the your version of meaning of life? How do you see? Why do we do what we do?
To be able to look back and make certain that you have done something to improve the position of not just yourself, but of other people as well. Whether it's just you've made one individual happy, or you've improved by bringing up good children or helping students, but to be able to look back and say, I did good things. I made some people happy. That I think is probably the meaning of life for me.
Brilliant. So thank you for your time. It's
I've
been a
enjoyed it.
pleasure.
Thanks very much indeed. And I look forward to seeing you next time I come to Latvia and visit my grandfather's homeland.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you.
Yeah, bye.